Hi there. Welcome back to Prices at the Pumps, our Wednesday weekly look at all things energy related on SaltWire. I'm Scott Squires, pleased to be joined as usual by the energy expert Dan McTeague. And Dan, a couple items on the agenda as we usually do. But first things first, consumers want to know in this region, right? Prices adjusted Thursday in Newfoundland and Labrador, and then Friday for the rest of the Atlantic region. First up, what's Newfoundland and Labrador going to get tomorrow at the pumps? And then on Friday, what's the rest of the region going to see, Dan?
Well, Scott, we were spot on to the 10th of a cent for both gasoline and diesel last week. And as long as we have regulatory authorities obeying the law of the market, not trying to twist things to their own advantage to make Dan McTeague's always reliable predictions look off, we are looking at a scenario this week, Scott, where Newfoundland will experience a 3.2 cent a litre increase for gasoline, and for diesel, a 5.2 cent a litre increase. If you're using home heating fuel, look at about a 4.4 to 4.5 cent a litre increase. But as we said last week, this is the beginning of the move upwards. And although some were claiming in other media in Canada that, 2024 would be great, we'd see prices drop right from the get-go, they've got it wrong. Oil prices have gone up about an average of $5 a barrel since the beginning of the year. And of course, finally, geopolitical tensions are starting to weigh heavily. So we're likely to see PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick move up about 3 cents a litre, not 3.2, but 3 cents a litre, given that yesterday's markets and maybe even today's look a little weaker. But bank on a 3 cent increase for the three Atlantic provinces, and about a 4.5 to 4.7 cent increase for diesel. A little less than what we're seeing in Newfoundland, but only because there's an extra day of trade in which those numbers came down based on the average of 7 days. Of course, PEI uses what's called a rack price, and the rack prices have been going up dramatically. If I look this time last week, rack prices were about 76 cents, 75 cents. They're about 78 now. So with HST, that's about a 3 cent increase. Again, if you don't see that happening, then it's a bit of chicanery by our wonderful regulatory bodies who obviously want to keep their jobs and would hate to have someone like me predicting prices more accurately, consistent with my accurate predictions for all of North America.
Dan, I know we've done this before, but I think it's appropriate that we do it again. Might be the first time we've done it in 2024. But these predictions that you make and these numbers that you talk about, it's not Dan McTeague sitting there with an abacus making up his own numbers and pulling stuff out of thin air. Maybe just quickly again explain the data that you use and the things that you have access to make these predictions.
Yeah, so Dan McTeague spends several $100 a month acquiring data from various sources, but most importantly, oil price information service. And in that, it gives me the wholesale prices for not only Eastern Canada through the New York harbor, but also, of course, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which provides data every day into wholesale prices in the United States, which influences what we pay in pretty much all the prairies, and of course the Pacific Northwest market. So I see this day in, day out. I also have to contrast that with the value of the Canadian dollar, because as we know, or we should know, the price of every commodity that we consume in Canada is priced in US dollars. So all those out there say, hey, great, Canadian dollar. Yeah, but it's going to cost you more. It has a massive inflationary impact. Finally, I have to look at the taxes. So on any given day, and I do this, by the way, for the consumers, but I also help a lot of small independent gas retailers who contact me and say, what are the rack prices going to be in a couple of days before my supplier actually changes the price? So about 3 or 4 hours before that happens, I help them as well. I don't get paid for this. I mean, I get some media advertising or from time to time, maybe Google ads. But I do this mostly because it's something I've been doing since 27, 28 years when I pioneered gas price prediction to give a bit of a hedge to consumers. That's the essence behind it. That's how I do it. And by the way, it's also done in computer, but each and every day. And there's the days, the rack prices as of Thursday. So you can see every single day stuff for Chicago. Chicago would be Edmonton for Chicago. Toronto would be based on New York. And of course, there's your diesel. There's your Vancouver numbers. And I've been doing this, as I said. Here's just another example. Back to 2018. I have books out here that go back to about 2007. And prior to that, I was doing it more just for Toronto and a couple of other communities. So it's not a scientific thing, but it is something that I hope has served as a bit of a hedge and a bit of an advantage for people to fill up or to avoid filling up when they know exactly where the price is going up or down. And that, by the way, is available every single day on gaswizard.ca. Years ago, it was called tomorrowsgaspriceday.com. Again, a lot of people have copied my work. A lot of people are into the business, but they don't give 2 and 3 day predictions like I do. And that's why I think what we've been doing here, at least what I've been doing here, is save people a whole lot of money, not just in Atlantic Canada, but right across North America.
Well, certainly in my opinion, and I've gotten to know you quite well over the last couple of years, no one does it better in terms of knowing the markets, knowing the trends, and knowing where prices are going. We appreciate having you with us here on SaltWire. And Dan, you mentioned, right, you're looking at another upward trend in the Atlantic region for diesel and gas again tomorrow and Friday. And we've seen now an upward trend the last couple of weeks after some weeks of decline, and consumers kind of feeling good about, hey, this isn't so bad, $1.39, $1.42. Now we're trending upwards. Is this something, again, knowing anything can happen with geopolitical events and the oil suppliers and et cetera, but now are you looking at this being the trend the next couple of weeks, couple of months, upward prices?
Very much so, Scott. The lower prices that we've seen have been a bit of a head fake. We've been enjoying these, relatively speaking, lower prices. But let's look at what's happening now. Prices are being driven not only by a weaker Canadian dollar, they're being driven by the second carbon tax in Atlantic Canada. So we saw about a 2.5 cent increase, which many were complaining about on January the 1st. We're also seeing motivationally on the international level, the ignorance towards fundamentals. Setting aside, as the markets have done, things like what the tensions we're seeing in the Red Sea, avoiding the fact that there's a massive stimulus program, which is going to be very bullish for consumption of energy coming out of China. And I think perhaps the other one, which is the no-brainer, more obvious, is these low prices tend to increase demand. The United States is seeing a pretty significant rebound in its economic fortunes. Oil and gasoline prices cannot remain at depressed levels, no matter how many energy traders who are actually not involved with fundamentals, but use their artificial intelligence or, consult their hedgers as to how they should position. Energy prices are deeply discounted. And when you have moves by, governments and woke capitalists to try to suppress the amount of investment going into that energy, you wind up clearly with a shortage. I think that shortage is starting to pull away. This time last year, we saw a massive build in inventories. We're not seeing that this year, and it's very early in the year. So when we actually do need those products, as we switch over from winter to summer gasoline and demand starts to move up and taxes are imposed and the Canadian dollar doesn't respond to any increase in energy prices, you're going to see a continuation, not every week, but between now and April, of a very unpleasant increase. I expect gasoline prices between now and the 1st of April to move up about 10 cents a liter from where they are today, or where they will be on Thursday and Friday, and about 12 cents a liter for diesel. Now, diesel, of course, will come down after April as people use less heating oil. But at the end of the day, the world economy is shaking off any doldrums, and demand is extraordinarily strong. The cost of ignoring this and tiptoeing around it and adding oil to the, taking oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is only going to make a bad situation worse.
And Dan, we again are getting closer day by day, week by week to April 1st, 2024. April Fool's Day for some and maybe for many. Because again, just remind folks what happens April 1st.
Yeah, April 1st is D-Day for consumers. That's when the federal government's cool carbon tax increases about 3.5 cents a liter for us here in Atlantic Canada, about 3.3 in the rest of the country, and diesel moves up about 4 cents a liter. That's on gasoline, on top of the 14.31 that you're paying for gasoline right now, and the 18 cents you're paying for carbon taxes. Not just the first carbon tax for diesel. So what we're looking at is a pretty substantial increase. That'll be net 3.5 cents a liter come April 1st. And if that isn't enough, then April 15th rolls around. We switch from that winter to summer blend gasoline. That's another 6 cents a liter. So between now and then, 10 cents a liter, another 10 cents a liter by the middle part of April. So if you are, a little upset and a little crusty over $1.65, $1.70 for a liter of gasoline, you're not going to like $1.90. A lot of it is federal government taxes and moves that have crippled our ability to maintain and to keep those prices in check, especially for a country which is as energy rich as we are. That's a real shame.
And then we've referenced some of the geopolitical things that are going on. Of course, the Russian invasion and war in Ukraine still ongoing. The tensions in the Middle East as high as they've ever been. The situation with the Red Sea and the Houthis and attacks on shipping lanes there. But outside of that, which of course is a lot, what are you seeing? Haven't heard a whole lot from the OPEC nations lately. What are you seeing? Are you seeing any rumblings of increasing production, keeping it the same, reducing it? Because decisions that OPEC nations can make can also play large into what happens here in North America.
They do, and OPEC still has about 38 to 40%, plus with Russia about 42% of the global oil supply. Now, some of that may not mean much where you have a country like the United States, which seems to be able to increase its shale output. But that's a little bit like a bell curve. At some point, it's going to start to slow down. The issue here isn't so much who cuts production, who doesn't provide production. OPEC is showing extraordinary discipline in terms of its numbers, with the exception of Iran, which I think can't move much more. There isn't a whole lot coming on. Yes, there's promise in Guyana. Guyana is doing very well, but it'll be a long time before they actually start to ship more oil to the rest of the world. This is going to be a demand picture. Demand for oil, despite all of the, the talk of EVs and, the transition to different energies, oil is going to be up about 2.5% in demand this year, at least 2 million barrels. So if no one's producing more to meet that, then we're going to continue to face this veritable shortfall. And that shortfall can only be matched by higher prices. Now, maybe we'll get lucky this summer. We won't. We'll have another year where there's been very few, refinery outages, very little in the way of hurricane activity. But I'm not one of those who believes you can win lotteries back to back. And sooner or later, we're going to see a much more reasonable summer where hurricanes happen, disruptions happen, refineries run into trouble. And that will, of course, add more wood to the pile in terms of higher prices. So 2024 could be a carbon of 2023 in some instances, but all things being considered, and having done this for so many years, I suspect that the good times may be behind us, at least for 2024 and 2025.
And then you and I talk about a lot of things outside of the straight up prices at the pumps for consumers. And you and I talk a lot about the transition away from oil and gas and the move to everything EV and electric vehicles. And, you and I have talked about that there's a path forward, but, perhaps it should be a little more tepid and go a little slower. We won't go down that road right now. But I do want to talk to you about an article that I saw on X, and it's by Javier Blas. Yep. And this particular article is a column that he wrote for Bloomberg. And I'll read you a little bit of it now, because I know we chatted about it previously before we were recording. But the headline is, "You'll have to pay to use the highway, blame EVs." Now, again, this is a European-based article, but it says, if government succeeds with their green plans, the fuel tax revenue they rely on will disappear. That's, of course, the revenue from oil and gas companies, oil and gas revenues. It's time to devise an alternative system. And basically, that alternative system that he's talking about is basically paying to play. So paying to travel on the road, taxes on roadways. In other words, you got to go Halifax to Truro. You're going to have to pay X amount of a travel tax. How likely do you think that is? And is that a likely scenario that we could see here in Canada?
Well, it's very likely when you consider the federal and provincial governments imposing a minimum of 40 cents a litre on taxes. Places like Vancouver, closer to 80 cents a litre. Here in the Maritimes, a little closer to 55, 60. And that's not just the federal tax of excise tax, the provincial road taxes, carbon taxes and whatnot. When you take that away, it means that governments are going to be short to about $25 to $28 billion a year. You don't have that money. You can't build bridges. You can't restore and maintain the infrastructure that you have. So I didn't want to get into the cost of EVs and how unpractical it's going to be to have to increase the grid. That loss of revenue, if these individuals get their way, and we all drive those kind of vehicles, I think you're going to see a scenario where inevitably you're going to be charged per kilowatt hour, or you're going to be charged a fee per kilometer traveled. That's in the books. That's likely to happen. I think British Columbia is very seriously looking at this right now. But as the penetration of EVs continues, it's inevitable that the governments are going to have to hit and hit hard, because not only will they be bleeding with the removal of internal combustion engines, they're also putting out these massive incentives to build the infrastructure, to incentivize companies to build battery plants, and of course, get consumers to drive these things, big, fat, huge subsidies. So how are you going to pay for all those things when the very means in which you have contributed mightily to undermining, how are you going to pay for it? Then we have to look at the other side of it. If there is no more oil and gas industry in Canada, what are you going to do with the 12% of your economy that just disappeared overnight? How are you going to make up another $30 to $35 billion in annual revenues that you used to get? The fact is, these folks are dreaming Technicolor. They've not thought this through. And had they thought it through, unless they have some plan to tell people you can't drive, period, we're going to limit what you can do, how much you can charge, where you can go. And that seems to be the way this plan is heading. Canadians better smarten up very quickly, because their governments haven't the foggiest idea what they're doing. They're doing this on the fly, and unfortunately, that's not a very good way to conduct the affairs of a country.
And I'll come off the back of that in a sec, but I just want to let folks know Javier Blas, again, I had him on X. He lists himself as an energy and commodities columnist. Thank you, Dan, at Bloomberg.
Yeah, very well known. Yeah, I've done interviews with him before.
So that's where you can find his work, and you can find that column there. And Dan, just going back to what you were saying, I mean, that's an actuality, right? That's not a maybe. If oil and gas is phased out, if that's taken away out of the Canadian economy, as you said, billions of dollars of revenue in government coffers goes away. The government's going to have to recover that, and they're going to have to find means and ways to do it. I can't say that it's definitely not being talked about, but I haven't seen any Liberal government reigning in power person with the Liberal government in Canada talk about this, and to say to the Canadian people, to the consumer, to Canadians, oh, well, we're going to lose this revenue, but here's how we're going to replace it. In your opinion, you spent 18 years as an MP and a good part of your life in the political realm. Why aren't government officials being pressed more on these questions about where's that revenue going to be replaced?
Well, it's about virtue signaling. It's about telling people that EVs are clean and internal combustions are not, when in fact the other way around is quite true. Internal combustion engines and their efficiency are a lot better for the environment and the lifespan of the vehicles. They don't involve mining, children mining by hand in atrocious labor conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They don't involve billions of dollars of debt that we are incurring to subsidize to build these things that China will already have an advantage of 10 to 15 years on us, and will be able to provide much cheaper products. They don't want to talk about the massive subsidies the country cannot afford, not just to build these things, but as I mentioned earlier, to build out an infrastructure. I don't think, it requires a whole lot of sophistication to say, while we have virtue signaled our way in saying this is cool and trendy, we haven't considered countries that are slightly more advanced on this. Germany in a total recession, a country now that's basically painted itself into a corner, being at the beck and call of Russia, and the major policy blunder of the Merkel government with energy wind, in which now Germany is ripping down its cool windmills in order to reopen lignite coal plants. We're seeing Britain moving towards opening up the North Sea so it gets natural gas because it has no more energy. We're seeing Italy now doing deals with Libya to get more oil. Europe is a disaster, and it's an example of what happens when you don't look before you leap. As Jean Chrétien, my old boss in Prime Minister, used to say, you have to be careful in making public policy. Before jumping into the pool, you want to make sure there's water in it.
Something I want to reference as well. We won't get too deep into it, but seeing some of what's going on over in parts of Europe and in particular France with farmers, basically having these convoys of tractors and protesting what's happening. Again, Dan, we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but what do you make of that? And is there a likelihood that we could see that type of pushback from folks that work in agriculture and farmers here in Canada?
Well, we could, and I think we will. And in fact, we might. The question is whether or not the media wants to pick up on these things. But what you're seeing, of course, not just in France, but across much of Europe, Belgium, Germany, Spain, is an example of what happens when people have said enough to an agenda being promoted by an unaccountable organization called the World Economic Forum. It's basically saying, hey, no more nitrogen in the use of your farms. No more cows. Go kill 10,000 heads of cattle, as we saw in Ireland. People are pushing back, and they're pushing back because they realize their back is to the wall. And while every country has very different ways of looking at this and issues of subsidies and whatnot, the reality is that in Canada, we have a plan to remove nitrogen from our production of food products. Do you know what that will do? It will drop our production by about half. The Haber-Bosch process, by which we have used for many years to improve the per acreage yield, requires natural gas, which of course the climateers dislike and want to remove. By doing so, they risk stable food supply, while at the same time culling the number of farmers out there who would be able to provide that. So there's a lot to unpack, but the reality is it's all part of the same game. The folks that want to provide you solar power and wind turbines that don't work when it's cold or when it's warm, the same people that want to provide you electric vehicles that are unreliable, that are expensive, and cannot be anywhere near interesting unless they're given massive subsidies and which have a significantly detrimental environmental impact, are now also saying less food. I hate to say it, but it's true. Not far from where I am here in Ontario, a bug plant. Start eating insects. Look, you can't make this stuff up, but this is the direction the country is taking. And if it doesn't wake up soon, a lot of us are going to be very disappointed. No wonder the government is offering its policies unmade.
Dan, I know that there's a lot of folks that are with you and are followers of yours, but there's also some folks that are like, come on, Dan, got to challenge you on that. So when you're not with us here on SaltWire, where can those folks find you? Where can they reach out to you? Because I know that you're always willing to engage in a respectful and lively debate. So when you're not with us here at SaltWire, where can folks find you?
Yeah, Gas Price Wizard is my Twitter handle. Gaswizard.ca is the prediction for gas prices, and affordableenergy.ca is where you can get and send me emails as to your thoughts. I'm getting a lot, obviously, on Twitter, where you can basically get from anyone and anyone. And I'm quite willing, as you quite rightly pointed out, to engage. The good part is that if you give it to me, you're going to get it back. I believe in being very fair with people and provide as much a measured response.
Dan, you are one of my favorite and most entertaining follows on X, formerly Twitter. So thank you for all of that. And before we let you go, give us an update on what's happening in your area. I know we just had our first big nor'easter, our big snowstorm this past Monday. I know there's a blanket of white now, certainly here in the HRM Halifax region. How are things up in your neck of the woods up in Ontario, Dan?
All green. We've had our cold for the first 3 weeks of the month, 2 weeks of the month, 3 weeks roughly, and then it started to melt. So it looks like we're in a bit of a melting period here, +7 here in Ontario. But I suspect that that's going to change around by next week, and we'll be back to another second round of Mother Nature. More importantly, though, and unexpectedly, my heating bills are down substantially, and that's a good thing. I can go spend it on things that'll help stimulate the economy.
And keep your wife happy, right?
In the process, yes.
And speaking of wife and family, how's the family? How's the kids? How's the whole McTeague
the
clan?
McTeagues are doing well. They're back to school. Everybody's back to work, and everyone's trying to get past January. The January blows economically, and everyone knows what I'm talking about. Whether you're a mechanic or whether you happen to be someone working in the health field, you will know that the month of January is always a slow one. So let's get past this month and let's get this economy rocking and roaring again. And to do that, let's not forget the importance of the thing that keeps us warm and healthy and happy and prosperous, whether we like it or not. I don't like them. They don't like me. The oil and gas sector is pretty damn important in this country.
And Dan, it's important that you are able to join us each and every week here on Prices at the Pumps and SaltWire. We appreciate it, and we'll look forward to doing it again next week.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to be here on SaltWire with you, Scott. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan.